Oh yeah. So we've got our prepared documentation for planning and building approval clustered together with a couple other subjects. And one of the reasons these things are clustered together is because that's typically what also happens in practice, in work as well. And we'll go through what both planning and building approval are. But put simply, it will be the bulk of your work as drafters, and or to a lesser extent designers. Designers will have a few other things on their plate, but for the drafting side of things, that is the bulk of the work that drafters will have to do, is getting things ready for planning and building approval. So we've got into the Learn page. Just a very simple overview. So we have several other subjects, as I said, clustered in with that. So we've got 4010 for planning approval and 4011 for building approval. And then we've got 4003, collect, apply and store building design project information. So the whole, or the underlying purpose of planning and building approval, in fact, the main thing that you do as drafters is about conveying information. So drawings are a fantastic way of conveying spatial information, and your specifications are a good way of conveying all the finer details of a building. But technically, what you are involved in is the collation of information, be that evidence, analysis, so calculations for various different things, be that communications with clients and decisions that have been made, or other reports and things like that from other consultants. So you're pulling together all of this information. So a very important thing as to what you have to do as drafters is collect, apply, and store building design project information. So what I'll drive home in this subject is that you've really got to stay on top of your filing, keep everything really well organised. Two reasons for that. One is because there's so much to this subject, so much to the whole cluster, you really won't find it very easy to get through if you don't do that. Secondly is that recycling information is incredibly important for drafters. The whole you don't want to keep doing the same thing again and again and again and again and again when it's the same thing or a very similar thing. So you want to do something once and then either replicate that exactly for some situations, or save it as a template and use that for other things that you're doing. And the other reason why this is incredibly important is because in practice you're going to have people contacting you partway through a job and say, hey, what is the answer to this? Where is the documentation for that? Do we have the calculations for this, etc. They'll be wanting to drag out information partway through a project. If you have all of that information at hand, that's it. Saves you time, saves you hassle. But, and I hope it never happens to anybody, but it happens in the industry, is sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes there are errors for all sorts of reasons, and people get sued for all sorts of reasons. You want to be able to ensure that you can pull out all of the documentation that's related to that project for any given point in time if you're called upon to do so in court. Actually, one other final thing, I didn't think of it before, is what I used to do for work prior to working at the TAFE here is work for an engineering firm that did repairs to buildings. So buildings get damaged by fire, water damage, impact damage, cars and trucks and things slam into buildings and so on from time to time. It makes our job so much easier if we have all of that original documentation. Yeah, I guess that doesn't really come back to you as drafters. There's no sort of benefit to you, but to the people who end up working on that building later on, it makes things significantly easier and significantly cheaper. So that's really essentially it's a service to your building owners and people who will occupy that building later on. And it's not just for repairs to buildings; it's for modifications to buildings, things like that. If we want to core through this concrete slab because we're running, retrofitting some fire services or something like that, we want to know exactly what we're cutting through. So it's clustered with collect, apply, store, building design, project information. That will be in large part covered by everything that you're doing through the planning approval process and then into the building approval process. 4004, set up BIM capable software and files for building design drafting projects. So once again, to do this subject, you have to use BIM capable software. So the nominated software for this subject is Revit. Now, I've got to confess, some of you know this already, I'm really quite a dinosaur in relation to drafting programs. So I studied back when you did hand drafting and when we were starting to do CAD, like AutoCAD. Then in our office we used only AutoCAD because working with fine details, etc., AutoCAD's far better than Revit. The office, I think they still haven't moved to using Revit at all because of how it applies. And you'll find that there are still plenty of people out there that still use only AutoCAD, but we use Revit for this. So because I really don't know Revit very well, I won't be able to help you with some things. I will, but yeah, this semester we don't have, like last semester we had Andreas in to help with the class as well. We don't have him scheduled in so much for time, but I might still be flicking a few questions to him from time to time. But you'll find that this is very much the case within working in any office as well. That you'll be doing drawings for somebody who doesn't know how to use a drawing program. So many of the drawings, or many of the engineers I was doing drawings for, well, in fact, only one of the engineers I was doing out of about a dozen, only one of them knew how to use AutoCAD. For the rest, it was all getting information, hand-drawn sketches, and a lot of notes in very much shorthand sort of abbreviations, and I'll cover some of those bits a little bit as well as we go through. So quite often, the way you're solving problems is by chatting to other drafters in the office. So I'm completely fine with all of that. That it is very much about networking. It's about pulling your resources, asking each other how you can get around certain things. How did you do this? How did you do that? Etc. But this one here, set up BIM capable software, that's actually covered by Russell. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to submit some screenshots to show that yes, you set up Revit on your computer at home, and then that's going to be fairly easy for him to tick off.
It has to be on my computer at home because mine doesn't run Revit that good, so I prefer to use the copies over here.
Yeah. Okay. You might have to shoot Russell an email to ask about that. So from what I've read through it, it says about setting that up yourself at home, because well, you have to set it up somewhere, and because it's already set up here, I guess you can't. And because we can't modify, I think certainly students wouldn't be able to modify any of the programs that are on these computers.
Yeah, no.
No, yeah. Or if you add something that's gone as soon as you turn it off.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to ask Russell about that. But you bought this 18 weeks
Okay.
plus 20 weeks yet to sort that out.
Okay.
So, but yeah, better you get on to Russell sooner rather than
Okay.
later. So set up BIM capable software. Import and transpose information from external sources into digital building design drawings. So what you'll have to do in this subject is bring in information from elsewhere. Sometimes it's going to be fairly simple. Sometimes it's going to be a bit annoying, bit of a workaround. But once again, that is the drafting office. That's exactly how things work. So, bringing in information from external sources. And store and retrieve building design documentation. So once again, it's all about filing systems, keeping stuff, being able to retrieve it, get it back. So that's all the subjects that the planning and building approval are clustered with. So as I said, for those that are doing the planning and building approval, it is a lot of work to get done in this 18 weeks, because what we'll be working with are 3 different projects. And when you're in an office, typically when you're in an office, things are all set up for you. There is, you have your drawing program, but you have all of your Revit families or CAD blocks, all of that information all set up. Sometimes you'll have to update things, sometimes you'll need to modify things, but mostly, if it's a functional office, it'll just be drag and drop, bringing in stuff all the time, because the thing is, it's about collating all that information and conveying all that information. If you're not able to do that really quickly and pull everything together really quickly into cohesive plans, but your competitors are able to pull everything together into cohesive plans, they can either charge less, which means they'll get the work, or they can make more money per hour. That's simply how it works. And so it is all about being as efficient as possible. So in your drafting offices, you'll have things really well set up, or if you end up working as drafters for yourselves, doing some jobs for people, you'll set those things up yourself. One thing that we don't have within this class, well, you are given a decent amount, and there are Revit families on Revit, etc., and you're given a fair bit, but there is still a lot of development of things to do. So you will be spending plenty of time developing things for the first time, getting your templates and stuff like that. But the bonus of that is you have all of these templates. Then when you finish, you have all of this stuff. Certainly keep it all, because you'll end up using that in practice, and then you build upon that in practice. What we can't really do within 18 weeks is take you from at whichever point you are now through to we can do complete functional drawing sets and specifications for all projects. There will certainly be a great deal more that you just keep adding to this as you go along. But it's a fairly good start. So because you won't have everything given to you as you would have in an office, there is that development. So it does take time. But I'm here to help you through all of that process. Also, what we need to do within this subject is we need to cover 3 projects. So it says within the unit of competency that we have to do a residential project, so Class 1 building. We have to do a Class 10 component, so that's a non-habitable structure. We have to do a multi-residential building, and then we have to do another building of Class 2 through to 9, so some form of commercial building. So what we've got is we've got a simple residential building, a project up on Shepherds Hill Road, very, very simple residential project. We've got multi-residential property at Henley Beach South, and then we've got a commercial project within a very, how to say it, a very well-known address within the city. So you'll be doing Class 5 and Class 6. You're smiling?
No, because you're not saying the address, you're just saying very well known.
Oh, okay. Oh no, the address is on King William. No, sorry, not King William Street. On North Terrace in the city. Does anybody know Ayres House? Yeah, well, you do. Yeah. So Ayres. So was it? Oh, gee, is it Edward John Eyre? Is he the? Look, my South Australian history is not fantastic. Was that? Yeah. Cool. So you know, one of the explorers and surveyors for the very early days of white settlement in South Australia, obviously had a very fantastic house right in the city. That house has been retained, obviously state heritage listed, very tightly controlled. You'd never be able to bring the bulldozers in type of scenario, but that's exactly what we're doing here with this one. So we're going, all right, this is a site. We're going to be putting a building on there. One of the reasons for that site is it's public. So any of you, so for the first couple of projects, you're not allowed to go. I can't let you go to those sites and have a look around, and really there's no reason for you to do so. But for the final project, that site it's public property. So you're actually allowed to walk around on there. You're allowed to walk through there, have a bit of a look. You're probably not allowed to just enter into the building without chatting to anybody. And there's no need for you to enter into the building because we're treating it as a vacant site. But that site, you can go there, you can have a wander around, and it's in the city. If you happen to be in the city, as most people do from time to time, you can go past there and have a look at the context, because there's some really interesting stuff that's happening around that area at the moment. There's just been a tram stop built in North Terrace, adjacent that site. We've got, I think it's called Lot 49, the old Adelaide Hospital site, which is being redeveloped as a technology technological hub / community activities with connection to the Botanic Gardens. So that's a really, really interesting project that's happening there. Plus you've got the new Botanic High School out the back of that, and various bits and bobs happening there. So it's a very interesting site. First two projects not so interesting. Very, very standard. But look, if the thing is, yeah, look, as much as I like to make things interesting, they also have to be achievable. They have to be simple. And so project one is fairly simple, apart from a couple little headaches in there, which would be good challenges for you. So we're going to be pretty busy. So we've got these 3 projects to do. They're not small. They're not at all by any means. Well, it's not a small workload. And to take a project through both planning approval and building approval, basically working from scratch, setting yourself up, is actually a lot of work. So do expect that. Do expect that there's a lot to be done. The other thing that we'll be doing a lot within this class, within this subject, or this cluster of subjects, is there's a lot of consultations which happen as well. Now, as far as the unit of competency is concerned, there's a whole list of criteria that I have to ensure that at the end of the day, or at the end of the semester, when I sign off and say yes, I have to say, this person can do all of these things. I'm completely comfortable to put my name to say this person can do all of those things comfortably. Now, I have to essentially observe you doing each one of those things, meeting each of those criteria twice. We do have 3 building projects. So that actually gives us the opportunity to tick those things, each of those things off 3 times, because every single project is structured in exactly the same fashion. That you'll meet with the client, you'll meet with the building designer, you'll meet with the council, you'll ask questions of various different consultants. You'll do that for each of those projects. Now, because I have to observe you doing it twice, that enables me a little bit of freedom to go, you know, project 1, they're not quite there, I'll give them some feedback, get them like, you know, things can be a little bit more relaxed there, but then sort of, if there's some bits you're missing, if there's some really some bits you've got to work on, we start working on that sort of in that project 1, and by project 2 I go, look, you have to meet it, you have to be able to do this. But you know, my job is to very much to help you out with everything, show, you know, talk to you, and we'll go through how everything can be done, how you can best manage that, give you, impart a little bit of knowledge and experience that I have for doing all of these things. But also, I'm not about to just chuck you under the bus. I want to see everybody succeed. That's what we're here for. So definitely, you know, I've got plenty of time for helping everybody to get through everything.
Does that mean, just for the planning part, not the external subjects, does that mean we'll be doing everything in class, or are we doing things at home as well?
You probably will end up doing things at home.
Okay.
Yeah. There will. Yeah, it is fairly full on. There is a lot to get done. Some people, I've had a couple students that have actually been able pretty much to do everything in class without doing a great deal at home. But look, chances are you'll be doing almost as much at home as we're doing within the class. So you'll be mucking around with it at home. But because we've got these 3 projects which are all structured the same, if you manage to get everything happening there in project 1 really well, like you write your letters, you'll save those templates. If you nut out, this is how I need to handle a consultation, this is what I need to do in a consultation, and this is how I can do all the various different things within Revit. If you get all of those things sorted with project 1, then project 2 and project 3 are basically like a replication of those things. There's so much recycling that you can do, but just in a different context, dealing with some slightly different ideas. So it is very, how do I say, it is a very busy subject to start off with, because you're learning all these things, you're doing all these things for the first time, but if you get them sorted in project 1, then the rest will flow really quite easily, and you'll find that once we start getting to about mid-semester break, then you'll be doing less and less at home. So we've got our 3 projects for planning approval, 3 projects for building approval, same project, same things, or exactly the same properties, different activities. So what I think I'll do now is just go in here. What have we got? That one? Yeah, got it up already. Great. Give you a bit of an overview of what planning and building approval is. So some of you may already know quite a lot about planning and building approval. That, as I said before, that is the bulk of what you have to do as drafters, and so some people do have quite an appreciation for this process before deciding, yeah, I want to be a drafter. I want to be doing this work, because it is the bulk of what we do. So, what is it? The thing about, so people want to live in houses, right? Or they want to use buildings for various different things. we, particularly in South Australia, things are a little bit more difficult for owner builders. So we've got various different building regulations around the country. We don't, within Australia, we don't have the one Development Act for Australia. We've got Development Acts for various different states. Within our state of South Australia, our Development Act says that we need to get council approval against their zoning requirements and local stipulations, and then we need to get building rules consent as assessed against the National Construction Code. And the National Construction Code, as you probably already know, it has a deemed to satisfy path. So that's basically a recipe for how we can build this particular building to meet the base requirements, or there are performance solutions. So the National Construction Code says you can also build a building in an engineered fashion, or in another way, in inventive fashion, but it has to be certified by a relevant engineer, and it has to meet certain performance requirements. Like, for example, with a house, there is actually no requirement to say you need to have gutters. But what it does say is you cannot let water enter the building fabric. So you have to work around that. So possibly you can build it another way that a shell and external skin is perfectly impervious to that water. Hence, you don't need to have gutters. So under the Development Act, we need to get that planning approval from council, and we need to get the building rules consent from either council or from a private certifier. Has everybody in this room heard of a private certifier before? Great. That's by and large the way things are done now. So when I finished my studies, yes, private certifiers were around, but it wasn't the bulk of the way everybody was doing things. A lot of people were still sending complete sets of drawings to councils. Councils would have on their staff members who can certify things against the National Construction Code. Now, your larger councils still have all of those staff there, but your smaller councils, they've shed those staff, and if you can still lodge your building rules consent with the council, but they'll send it off to a private certifier anyhow. So if they're sending things off to a private certifier and you're paying for those things essentially through your fees, it makes a lot more sense for many people to have a relationship with a private certifier, be sending their plans and specifications to that private certifier to enable them to get some feedback about, the private certifier will say, look, I'm not particularly happy with this, can you change this, do this, and make those changes, and then get it through. But if you have that working relationship with a private certifier, that is going to be far quicker than if you're actually dealing with that through the council. The reason it's going to be far quicker is you'll be able to get them via email or on the phone. Well, you may be able to get them on the phone, but if not, you'll get them via email, you get a response within a couple of days. If you lodge things with council, and we'll see this later on the council websites, they give times at which you can expect a response to an approval. It might be 2 to 4 weeks for planning approval, it might be 6 to 8 weeks for building rules consent. We're talking in weeks, and we're talking things like 6 to 8 weeks. If you send something through to council and there's just a small thing, like I've heard previously, I'd specified M10 cup head bolts through a post shoe. Council got back to me and said, no, that product manufacturer specifies M10 coach screws. Right, it's tiny things like that. Now, in that case, council sort of just let that one go without sort of going through the process again. But sometimes they will make you go through that process again. So you wait 6 to 8 weeks to be told, oh, there's a little problem, and you go through that process, change that very simple thing might take you 5-10 minutes, and it waits in the cycle again. So that 6 to 8 weeks might be 12 to 16 weeks at times, in comparison to a day or two to get things changed with a private certifier. Now, if I was one of your clients, I'd have a problem with 12 to 18 weeks. Especially if it's an expensive site and we're paying, like $600 to $800 a week on interest for that site. These costs mount up incredibly, and if the cost of your private certifier is somewhere between $500 and $1,000, that's money well spent. So we've got the council involved. So currently, as it stands, it's only the council that can be making determinations on planning approvals. But that's currently as it stands, and this is changing. It will change within this semester. Well, it's slated to change within this semester, starting with a rollout in regional areas, and then the metropolitan area sometime next year. What's being rolled out are changes to the way planning approvals are done. So we've spoken about our private certifiers. They can assess building rules consent, and they can sign off on that for the council. Council can be basically not involved in that process. Under the new Development Act, so there's a Development Act of 2016, there is scope for professionals who are private planners. That means that you can treat them basically like a private certifier, but for the planning consent part, which is actually a huge, and this will be very interesting to see how it all happens, because the reason that we have, well, there are many reasons that we have planning approval. We want to ensure that people are living together harmoniously or conducting their activities harmoniously, that we have cities that are designed well both socially and economically. And within your different council areas, you have at times very different needs, very different concerns. Now, there are pros and cons to that. Developers would like things to be far more homogenous. They would like to go, all right, well, in Mitcham we've got a 6.5 metre above natural ground level building height. Then in Marion it's 6.8 or 7.5, etc. They want things to be the same everywhere. So they go, all right, well, we'll design this building to be 6.5 above natural ground level, and then same thing, no changes. That's excellent. That's really nice. They want to have certainty. They want to have homogeneity, so they know exactly what they're doing, that it's going to be really easy to deal with. And you'll find that there are many things between all your council areas which are the same. But you do have different needs for different council areas, and you've got different considerations. So if we've got, well, our whole of metropolitan area, that's broken up into various different council areas, and then in the outer metropolitan area, once again broken up into several different council areas. Does anybody know the city of Onkaparinga council area? Yeah. So, actually, I don't know where that name Onkaparinga derives from. Any South Australian history buffs? No. Anyhow, we've got the Onkaparinga River, which starts right at the back of the hills, sort of around Lobethal area. We've got some tributaries running into that, and then in the Onkaparinga Valley, which is Lobethal, Woodside, etc., through the right out the back of the hills there. All that water is gathered there, and it creates the Onkaparinga River, and it heads all the way through the back of the hills, comes through Kangarilla, etc., and then goes out to sea down at Noarlunga. So Onkaparinga Council was once many smaller councils. So it was lots of smaller councils, then they merged together, became a very large council, and in that process, they have to readjust how they see, like for each of those smaller council areas, how they see the or how they'll deal with those planning decisions and so on. And that was a big thing. They've ended up being a very big council with a very complex development plan to work out how we can be doing all these things, because people build differently and live differently in Kangarilla than they do in Morphett Vale, which is different than the way they build and live in part with Port Wollonga, etc. So we have these differences here. Obviously, those differences can be sorted out, and there can be an overriding development plan. There can be homogeneity for that whole area. It's been done before, and I think it's been done with several other councils as well, but Onkaparinga is one I've had a bit of involvement with. But still, your Onkaparinga Council, as broad as it is, that's going to be different than Adelaide Hills Council. So Adelaide Hills Council to the northeast of them, going all the way through that whole hills belt, they're going to have different considerations. Adelaide Hills, it's about having small-scale agriculture that doesn't impact negatively on the environment, and creates an aesthetic which is how do I say it, amenable to tourism. So Adelaide Hills, people come from interstate, come stay here, go to the wineries and things like that. There are different prerogatives there within the Adelaide Hills, and there are particularly within Onkaparinga. I'm not saying you don't have tourism within Onkaparinga, and you don't have small-scale agriculture, you don't have some beautiful places, but there are different considerations. As there are with, say, some of your Fleurieu councils, like Yankalilla Council and Victor Harbour Council and Alexandrina Council. Each one of those have their different needs and different ways of going about things. Victor Harbour Council has a very elderly population. Yankalilla Council has a far more rural / coastal type of development. Alexandrina Council has a very varied sort of development from Coorong, Lower Lakes, etc. But then think about all of those things. There's a great deal of difference between those councils, yet a huge jump in difference is when we go to Adelaide City Council. So once again, Adelaide City, that has far more public interaction. Primarily it's built up of private spaces, but there is far more public involvement within that city centre. There are far more public services which are provided within that city centre, and all of your transport sort of hubs around that city centre. So we have to be thinking about things very differently with all of our different councils. That's going to be a massive challenge for the New Development Act 2016, and also it's going to throw up some interesting things when we have private planners who can make planning decisions regardless of what council area they're in, and with some degree of autonomy to local councillors. So within our councils, we have a mayor. So they're the person that sort of sits, has an overview of the council, and then we have various different councillors. Some of them paid roles, some voluntary roles, or low pay, or paid well, remunerated well for travel. That sort of thing. So there's certain perks to being councillors, but it differs with every single council areas. But you've got councillors that will get together in their council meetings and make decisions about things. It takes the pressure off of these decisions from communities. So one example is, I live in a fruit production area, which is also a very, I guess it's a fairly attractive area that has the Tuaran to come through it, all that sort of thing. aesthetics is a major part. Now, there have been people saying, well, we want to build this particular infrastructure here and do this. It's a very difficult thing for the community to deal with, because the community goes, well, some people want it, some people don't want it, blah, blah, blah. The fantastic thing about councils are they can take something and go, well, look, our decision is final, and it doesn't involve you guys. We will assess this on its merit, make that decision, takes the pressure off of the community. So aids in that that harmony. So you have people sometimes, well, you know, they're people from that local council area who can be councillors, but not always. Sometimes people can live outside of council areas who'll be a councillor in an area, or even a mayor in an area. But they get together at these council meetings and they'll make these determinations. Now, with the new Development Act, it's going to be simple decisions to begin with that can be made by the private planners. We'll see how that evolves and how that will be tested, because I think invariably that will be tested. People or various different interests, etc., will want to test that model. They'll go, oh, well, I want to do this particular development and send it through my private planner because my private planner is going to say yes to me. And so, yeah, invariably, I think that's going to be tested. It's going to be a very interesting space. Currently, we are dealing with the system where everything still has to go through council. So no councils have changed over to that, but it's in the latter part of this year when your regional councils will be moving over to that. So,
but the private planners, they would still have to abide to the council rules, don't they?
They do have to abide. Yes, they do have to abide by the council rules. But another thing under the Development Act of 2016, one of the key motivations of that is to create more homogeneity between all of the councils. So we'll see some changes happening in development plans held by the councils. So those private planners, they can go, right, well, these are the things we deal with, and they'll be able to make those decisions without specifically referring to development plans all the time and going, okay, well, yeah. So they'll know they can make those decisions on various different things for simple matters, and then there'll be some other complexities that are council specific. I don't think we'll ever get rid of complexities which are council specific. There's always going to have to be, and we'll talk a little bit more about all those things and about development plans. But that is changing. And so that's going to be a challenge for us here at the TAFE as to, okay, how do we change all of this to deal with that? So currently you're being taught this is how the system operates currently, but within your professional practice, beware that things will change. This is one of the things that you're going to have to become abreast of. Beyond that, I can't give you any more information than that as to what's involved. I certainly hoped that this would be far clearer than it is, because we're months away from starting a transition, but from what I can get, there's very little understanding of how it's actually going to work. So it'll be a very interesting time. So that who is involved, that's about to change a little bit. So stay abreast of that. The next thing is, what do they need to know? With your planning approval, councils want, as I said before, they want uses, they want occupations, etc., to be harmonious. They want people to get along. What councils don't want are people writing them letters and phoning them up all the time saying, I've got a problem, right? Councils don't want problems. And that's basically their role, is to ensure that things get along as harmoniously as possible. So that's kind of how you have to be looking at a planning application. So one of the things they'll want to know is, what are you doing with your stormwater? So we get water runoff from roofs, and we also get water runoff from paving. On the Adelaide Plain, things are fairly flat. There's not a great deal of issue with that. But once you start getting into the foothills, the hills, etc., there are a lot of issues with water runoff. So the two major causes for complaints to the council are, first one is dogs, second one is stormwater. So it's right up there. Council are going to want to know, what are you doing with your stormwater? What are you doing with your runoff? Where is that going? Another thing, and this is not so current, but there's current discussion around it, and it's a little bit for the future. And we deal with this quite a bit more in Project 3, but I'll chat about it briefly today. It's about water conservation and greening the urban area as well. So our local councils, or within the metropolitan area, have gotten together to help devise a strategy for moving forward as to how we can incorporate more greenery into our urban environment, because it's fantastic in terms of supporting wildlife, native wildlife. It contributes significantly to the amenity of areas, contributes significantly to the property values of places. I don't know, does anybody know Victoria Avenue that sort of comes off? Yeah. If you went to Victoria Avenue with a chainsaw, cut down all those, I think they're plane trees, oak trees, something like that. If you went through there, chopped them all down, mulched them all up, I think you'd probably wipe about 30% off the value of all those properties on Victoria Avenue. Street trees with a continuous canopy, it's been shown, contribute significantly to site values of properties that abound on those streets. And and we even hear that in our rhetoric about, or political rhetoric. People say, oh, you live in the leafy suburbs. In terms of that's a higher class kind of area. There is that interconnect between greenery and property values and amenity. Property values are important to councils. Does anybody know why property values are important to councils?
Get more council rates.
Yeah, it's their revenue. So they have very limited sources of revenue. So they've got, council rates. I think land tax, that might be a state government. That might go to state government coffers, I think. But it definitely makes a big difference to state government revenues, and so this would be why they I imagine there's a motivation for them to be on board. But yeah, they've got council rates and parking fines. Now, obviously, it's probably a nicer thing. You'd feel far more comfortable being a council if you're getting the majority of your revenue from council rates rather than parking fines. Yeah? So property values are important, and the council will set their rate in the dollar. So for the site value, and some, actually I haven't dealt with this in a long time. I don't know who's doing what, but rating and taxing happens off of either site value or capital value. And this is another thing which is in flux at the moment. The determination of site value or capital value, that's done by the Valuer General's office, which has been sold off now by the state government. It's a private entity, and we're in the midst of that happening as well. So that's going to be interesting to see how that all happens, how it all flows together. But the value for rating and taxing purposes happens on either of those, site value or capital value. And there are various different motivations as to why some councils will raise their rates based on capital value, others will raise their rates on site value. So if you're rating on site value only, that gives an impetus for people to develop, because it means that they're paying the same rates, same council rates as the property next door. If they're a vacant land, they're paying the same council rates as the property that has a high-rise building on it. because it's about site value. It's about what that land is worth. Whereas if you're rating on capital value, that's site plus all improvements, then it's a more equitable value, but it doesn't give that impetus for development, etc. So there are various different reasons why you'd rate on site and capital value. Anyhow, so councils will set their own rate in the dollar. So they don't have anything to do with the determination of what your property is worth for the purposes of rating and taxing valuations. That's done by the Valuer General's Office, or I don't know what it's going to be called now, but maybe it's still going to be called the Valuer General's Office, but there's just a different revenue structure. They determine that, and they determine that primarily through statistical models. So that's actually what I used to do, write statistical models for determination of values. I did that when I just straight out of uni for a bit before I was doing the drafting. So produce these statistical models that say this is what these places are worth, or that's what the statistical model says they're worth, and there's a little bit of tweaking which goes on. So it's not like, okay, that's the site value of my property, I'll list it for sale at that. Anyhow, so councils will get those values and they'll have their rate in the dollar and they'll determine those. If we have councils which are promoting far more greenery within the urban environment, street trees, trees on private properties, etc., a far more amenable location, that means that site values will go up, which will carry capital values up, which will carry their revenues up. And they can either exercise less rate in the dollar, or they can get more money to be spending on libraries and cycle paths and whatever infrastructure they feel that the community wants, upgrading roads, things like that. So going right back to that stormwater thing, what do they need to know? The thing about the councils getting together and trying to get more greenery within cities has a great deal to do with what actually happens to stormwater. Because we have a lot of pressure on our mains water system as it is, so everybody would probably be aware of the desalination plant built down at the old Lonsdale refinery, the costs to that, and the running costs, etc., and all that sort of stuff, and the pressure on the Murray, and everybody knows what's happening probably up at the tributaries into Murray at the moment. We have very limited water to go onto plants and things like that, being in the driest state and the driest continent of the world. So it's going to happen a lot through stormwater, and it's about councils they like to see things such as permeable paving that allows vehicles to drive on it, but water can soak through that permeable paving. They like to see things such as stormwater detention, so whereby your stormwater is sent into a pit that has lots of aggregate and gravel in there that can soak into the ground before finally overflowing. They also like to see water tanks that have a detention and retention component, so that their stormwater systems aren't overwhelmed when there's a large rainfall event, but also that water is collected and used on site for growing plants and things like that, and for alleviating the pressure on our mains water system. So they want to see how you're dealing with your stormwater, and connected to that, they want to see what sort of plantings, etc., what's happening on that site, what that's going to look like. Other things they're going to want to see is what your building is going to look like. So that's the big thing for them, and that's the big part of your work, is to read the development plan, pick up what they say in the development plan, and do designs of buildings with the incorporation of materials that fit that development plan and fit that site. So I guess a good example of it. Does everybody know the area called Colonel Light Gardens? Yes. Yeah. No, no. Okay. Colonel Light Gardens is a place that's not actually that far from here. It's sort of Goodwood area if we sort of head towards the city, but a little bit east to that. It is it's a suburb which had a master plan initially. It was one of these so a lot of that inner suburbs were developed in a very higgledy-piggledy fashion. It was like, okay, individuals doing their own thing, and the whole thing about development approvals, etc. That is relatively modern thing. So there's plenty of development that happened within the Adelaide metropolitan area prior to any of this control, and things were happening in a very higgledy-piggledy fashion. Colonel Light Gardens is the first place that had a master plan where they said, okay, we're going to have roads that come off like this and create these areas, and it was characterised by a lot of bungalows. So 1920s, 1930s, so sort of designed from the American bungalow, like grabbing influence from that, but in an Australian context. So that area is typified by a certain type of architecture. The bungalow with the big verandas and things like that. What would be inappropriate to do would be to knock down a bungalow and build a neo-Tuscan 3-story set of townhouses. You wouldn't get council approval for that. So councils want to know what it looks like. If you've got a vacant block within Colonel Light Gardens, within the sort of eastern part of Colonel Light Gardens, the building had to be knocked down for some reason or other. They are going to want to see that what you build there is harmonious with everything else. It's a very sort of nebulous thing, but quite often it's easy to say what's not harmonious. So the Neo-Tuscan, that's not harmonious with your bungalows, etc. And to the other extreme, it's kind of easy to say what would be harmonious is buildings that utilise the same materials. So we've got tiled roofs or corrugated roof sheeting. We've got large verandas. We've got steep roof pitches, sort of 35 degrees. We've got features like Dutch gables, So you think of your bungalows in your 1920s, 1930s sort of construction. Think about those features. If you put those features onto your proposed building, similar sort of scale, mass, etc., as to what's existing, setbacks from roads, things like that, then you will get planning approval. Well, you will get planning approval. You vastly increase your chances of getting planning approval, and that's what it's all about. So some areas, these things are far less controlled. You can kind of do whatever you want. But regardless of how tight the restrictions are on an aesthetic within an area, council still wants to know what it is going to look like. The other thing that will dictate what a building looks like, it's not only the council and the development plan that have a say in that. There are also developers' encumbrances, which is the way a great deal of land is subdivided today. Is you have greenfield sites. So greenfield, brownfield sites. Brownfield, that's land that's previously been built upon. Greenfield is land that was used for agricultural purposes or non-building related purposes, which is then developed. Those greenfield sites are, I'd say, look, I don't know the stats, I don't know the breakup, but I think they're the bulk of what we're building upon today. So within those greenfield sites, you have, does everybody know Golden Grove? Golden Grove? No? Or does anybody know a large development?
It's the new part of Blackwood.
Yeah, oh yes,
well?
yeah, Craigburn Farm. Well, it's called something else now, isn't it? It's Blackwood something or other. Blackwood Park, maybe?
Or Estate?
Blackwood Estate, yeah. Craigburn Farm just doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Yeah, everybody know Blackwood Estate? And, yeah, but anybody, I say could picture a new subdivision where we've had some farmland, then it all gets chopped up. There's plenty to choose from around Mount Barker or the extremes of the metropolitan area. Whenever that happens, well, yeah, I could say pretty much whenever that happens. There might be some instances where it doesn't happen, but by and large, whenever you have a development like that, the people doing the development will put encumbrances on the title. So an encumbrance is anything that encumbers what you can do with that property. So it stops you from doing something. It says you have to do whatever you do within these parameters. So those encumbrances lodged on the title, typically developers' encumbrances will be that fence heights are a maximum of 1.8 metres high, have to be ColourBond colours from this particular range. Roofs have to be either tile or ColourBond. They have to be a certain pitch. Wall materials can either be rendered or brick, etc., etc. Gardens have to be established within the first year of occupation of dwelling. All these sorts of things. So developers of these estates will have a say, and the reason they will have that say is because it gives confidence to people purchasing within that estate to go, this is what it's going to look like. Because if the developer just carves up an area and it's a bit more Wild West, and you've got the Neo-Tuscan right next to the straw bale house next to the California bungalow, people will have no idea what that suburb is going to look like. So have developers who have a say in that, have councils that have a say in that. Councils will be checking to see that you actually meet those developers' encumbrances as well. When you submit your plans to council, they don't go to the developer, but council will want to make sure that you do meet those encumbrances. So it's the development plan, but then also the encumbrances, that they will check the aesthetics of the place against. So they want to know exactly what it's going to look like. They want to know, materials, colours, massing, roof slopes.
Would there be rules in there about how much percentage has to be green, or how much percentage can be built, or is that somewhere else?
Yeah, there are rules about plot ratios. So, and that's something that varies between councils. It varies between zones within those councils, and it will vary between policy areas within those councils. So that is something which there is no rule of thumb about. It'll be different, very different around the place. But yes, there are rules around plot ratios. There are also rules around private open space. So both of those things. Melbourne, some councils in Melbourne have it written in their development plans how much greenery or grassed space there needs to be as a percentage. Adelaide Metropolitan Councils don't have that. Well, I haven't encountered it in any of the development plans. But that's something that may happen. But we do have plot ratios, and we do have private open space. And for multi-residential properties, you have also communal open space as well. So areas which are not built upon, which can actually be utilised in the residential sense, for private uses, or for public uses in the multi-residential space. And things like plot ratios, incredibly important for sites within the city. So if we have a building site within the city, typically the financial imperative is to go as tall as possible. Go, right, how much office space can we, how much bang for our buck can we get with this site? So those plot ratios have a massive determination on the value of those sites, and are a massive consideration within the city. Less so within residential and outer areas.
Seems to be an issue in Northfield.
Northfield's one of those ones that's brownfield site that. There is.
It's very compact.
Very compact, and that was and it all sort of started with Oakden. If anybody knows Oakden, across the road there, when that was being developed, that was a while ago. They were really pushing the envelope with the width of their roads, with any form of on-street parking, with getting everything all
all closely together. It has created somewhat of a village feel. I haven't really spent any time there in the last decade, but I think they're going for the same sort of thing.
Very narrow houses,
Great, yeah.
gardens that are very tiny.
Yeah.
But it's all, I guess it's got to be affordable, close to the city.
Yeah, and I hope you don't mind. I know that you're from the Netherlands or have that. So I lived in the Netherlands for a while as well. Once again, one of those places where things are close together, where you do have very small backyards, but that's offset by some fantastic parks, some fantastic community facilities, things like that. Things happen far more in public spaces in a densely populated location like the Netherlands than they do in Australia. Australia, it's far more about cricket in your backyard kind of thing. Well, that's the way, but we're very much in that sort of transition, and so yeah, things like our public spaces have to pick up, have to get much better to work with that, and our public transport has to get much better to work with that sort of thing as well. Whenever you get densely developed locations, which you still have to get in your car to drive to the city or drive to wherever you need to go because the public transport is too cumbersome, too slow, etc. Then that puts load on other things. So yeah, definitely different pros and cons about all of that. And councils try to manage all of that. Now, obviously, they don't get that right all the time. And history, will often we have to leave it up to history to say, was that good, was that not good. So yeah, but that's experiencing that within there. And look, there are all sorts of things we'll find out. Okay, was it a good idea? Was it not a good idea? Did it create a good village feel? Did it create something which is non-harmonious to the way Australians live or to the metropolitan area in general, how it all works? Because things, how to say it, there are flow-on effects from everything within the metropolitan area. So they want to know those things. What else do they want to know? They want to know how tall it is. They will want to know whether you have any windows that are overlooking onto neighbours. And if you do have windows which are looking into backyards and things like that, how are those windows treated? Is it frosted glass? They will want to know what those rooms are used for. If you have big windows in your bathroom that are overlooking the neighbours, they'll probably want them to be frosted glass. So councils want to know what those rooms are for. The other thing they will want to know, but it's far less regulated and controlled, is they will want to know how whether your property is going to be very energy efficient, whether it's going to be very eco-friendly as well, whether it's going to maximise the sun for in terms of keeping the building warm in winter and cool in summer. They're also going to want to know do you have any vehicle parking on your allotment? So that's one thing which is included in just about every development plan and within every zone within development plans is how many vehicles can you park on your site given your design, and whether there's on-street parking or not, because councils want to alleviate that the reliance on on-street parking. Now things are transitioning there. You've got things within the Adelaide City Council development plan which say they want development to be cohesive in maximising the utilisation of public transport and self-powered transport. So they're talking about walking, cycling, taking the bus, taking the train. So they want their development to be, supporting that through its design. Whereas your outer areas, they say no, you can't go building that house unless you have a carport, unless you have accommodation for your vehicles. they see that you do need to have cars on site. So you've got treatment of this issue in very very different ways between your different council areas. But they are going to want to know how are you housing vehicles on your site, what sort of accommodation you have for those, how are you entering your site. So are you creating a new driveway? Are you using an existing driveway? If you're on a busy road, they want to see that you can drive the car in, turn it around, and drive it out again. They don't want to see people reversing onto busy roads for obvious reasons. But that happens. You've got older developments when that wasn't much of a consideration, or when roads weren't particularly busy, and then those roads end up getting busy because of other development happens about the place. You still get people reversing onto main roads. It's a problem. So council will want to see that with any new development, particularly on major and what do you call it, the lesser arterial roads. They're going to want to see that you can drive a vehicle in, turn around, drive it out forwards. Other things they're going to want to know in their planning approval. I think I've covered just about everything that council will want to know. Does anybody else have any ideas about what council would want to know in their planning approval? I think that is about it. Or they want to see the number of bedrooms, etc. They want to see the size of the building as well. So, how are we doing? Is it fine for me to keep blazing through? People are fine with that, finding it interesting enough. If we need to take a break, I can organise a break, or if we want to just get up and go, that's also fine by me. So we've got our different local councils. So we've got our different council areas, and I can't remember how many there are within the metropolitan area and outer metropolitan area. There's, I guess, 50 or something like that. There's quite a few. But we have our local councils, and in the main, they're fantastic to deal with. So if you need any information, in my experience, having some informal discussions with duty planners on the phone has been incredibly helpful. Having councils have a prerogative to ensure that places are built. They want buildings to be built in their area. It increases their capital value, increases their revenues, etc. And they understand that properties should be developed to their highest and best use. So they want you to be building on there. So in the main, they're incredibly helpful. You do have some council areas that are a little bit notorious for requiring more information, for being a little bit more difficult to get planning decisions through, but that's typically driven by what they are having to deal with. So, and it all comes back to them wanting to keep everybody happy. So in Kernelite Gardens, that has these bungalows, it has an aesthetic, has a style, that is actually a little bit of a problem for council, because the residents within that paid above and beyond for the neighbouring suburbs to be in that bit, they want to ensure that it stays like that. And so councils have to manage that. So yeah, one of the, I guess, yeah, with our first project, we're dealing with Mitcham Council. Now I've had a bit of dealings with Mitcham Council. By and large, the majority of it has been fantastic. I have had some dealings with Mitcham Council where they said, "Oh look, we need this, we need this, we need this," and I'm thinking like, "Oh gee, if it was Playford Council, like just straight through." So you do have some. So Mitcham Council's one that does require, I guess better process, more information, really good quality stuff. Adelaide Hills Council a little bit like that as well. Adelaide City Council can be very much like that, but but for very obvious reasons. You know, it is a very public place. So you've got your local councils and your quirks with your local councils. As I mentioned before, that is changing in part, and we have a new system coming through which is going to be tested. It's going to be in flux. As with any new system, and this is a major upheaval to the way we do things in South Australia, there's going to be continual change to it. So it's something that you have to stay abreast of for the next 5 or 6 years before things really start to settle down into a bit of a system. Within our current system, we have councils making those determinations, but we also have a thing called res code. So that is like the forerunner to the private planners. It's a bit of like dipping the toes in the water, see how this works. So res code is a streamlined approval process that you can utilise in certain areas. So for certain predominantly residential areas that don't have large constraints or odd constraints over them, you can submit your plans via res code and get a streamlined approach to that for your standard residential developments. So, and we're going to learn to use SA Map Viewer later on, maybe later on today, possibly on Wednesday. So that's a map from SA Map Viewer. SA Map Viewer is a place where you can get all this geographic information overlaid with all this other information. It's fantastic. That shows the area in pink was all res code area. So in all of those areas, you can actually submit a standard residential development that meets certain criteria via res code and get that streamlined. As far as I know, that's going to stay. So we're going to have, we'll always have our local councils, but we'll have private planners, res code, and then private certifiers of building rules. So we've got the Development Act. So what is the Development Act of 1993? It's getting a little old, long in the tooth. And we now have the Development Act of 2016, which will be developed. So acts, they are acts of Parliament. So our state Parliament makes decisions about these things. They say, this is what we want to happen. They all say, yes, we, you know how that process works. So they pass the Development Act. That gives a guideline as to how things will happen, but it's not a very prescriptive document in and of itself. What then follows on from any Act of Parliament are regulations. So we've got the Development Act of 2016. Actually, I don't know yet where we're at with development regulations, but development regulations are the interpretation of that Act. And we have to abide by those regulations. Those regulations are far more prescriptive. So if we were to read the Development Act, it says that councils can impose zonings, etc., etc. Read the development regulations. It tells us how they can impose those zoning regulations. It tells us what fines there are for not doing it, who has to submit what, etc. So far more prescriptive. So we've got acts and regulations defining how we go about our planning approval. And then building approval, once again, local council, it has to go essentially via local council, but you can send it to your private certifier. But of course, local councils will be the ones that will maintain all of that documentation. So they'll retain all that documentation, as should your private certifier. So those local council, private certifier. Some local councils, as I said before, still keep some staff on to do assessments of buildings. They have to do it in accordance, they have to make that assessment in accordance with the National Construction Code. Everybody here, I take, is quite familiar with the National Construction Code. Everybody has an ABCB login. Yeah. So we have a new National Construction Code now as well, 2019. So some changes in that. And then that National Construction Code, within that it has referenced documents. So as I mentioned before, you've got your deemed to satisfy and your performance solutions. But fairly early on in the National Construction Code, it has a list of referenced documents. Mostly, those referenced documents are Australian standards. So we have a standards board who, through various consultants and contributors, write standards. They say, this is how it should be done. Everybody here...
Just a quick question. So this semester, are we still using 2016?
No, we're using 2019. Yeah. Yeah, no, I have to change that image. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so we'll be referring to 2019. And yes, there's an extra 30 pages or so in 2019. So your page numbers will be different. If you've got in your general notes, wet areas as per AS 3740 in accordance with 3.1.1 page blah blah blah, probably have to change that last bit. Page blah 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 blah. So yes, we've got more pages. We've got a few extra things added. So the National Construction Code will have its referenced documents, primarily Australian standards, but they're not all Australian standards. Some of them are called handbooks. So we have SAHB handbook. It's either 39 or 59 for roofing. So that's under the reference documents. But we also so that's national. But then we also, within that, we have our state and territory variations. Has everybody in here seen a state and or territory variation before? You have, Ami?
In the Australian standards itself?
No, within the National Construction Code.
Yeah, those are the red parts, isn't it?
The red parts, yeah, the red parts in the main body. So we've got state and territory variations within the main body, but then we've also, and it's a little bit annoying, at the end of the National Construction Code, you also have state and territory variations. So they're in two parts. So we've got national stuff, and then we've got SA specific, in the red, in the main body, but then there's also some other bits at the back as well. And what quite often happens as well is that, actually, well, no, I won't explain that right now. But yes, we have those state and territory variations. Those state and territory variations primarily start out life as a minister's specification. So we'll have state ministers for various different things. We've got a minister for education, minister for housing, etc. So the minister that's going to be doing a lot of stuff, changing things for our state and territory variations is the housing minister. They make determinations about things. So one of the things we've got here in South Australia is there's a minister's specification for suspended timber floors. So if you build a house with suspended timber floor, you've got to have a certain level of insulation. You've got to have a certain amount of energy supply which is autonomous to the main. So basically you have to have solar panels. So you've got a minister's specification that says this. So it starts out life as a minister's specification. As soon as that specification exists, then it has to be incorporated into your building approval considerations. But it starts out life as a minister's specification and then gets incorporated in the National Construction Code. So we get this coming out every 3 years or so. We get minister specifications whenever they want to make a minister specification. It's not always on a 3-year cycle. In fact, it's got no relation to that. So we'll have them come through and then they'll get in the next time, typically. So those minister specifications, they happen and they get included in the state and territory variations. That's another thing we have to consider with our building approval. That's where, once again, where private certifiers are very handy. because these things can change, and you don't necessarily. There is probably something, probably something that's happened which I don't know about yet. These things happen all the time. Typically, you'll be abreast of them, through your membership of Building Designers Association or Master Builders or HIA, whichever sort of body you're going to be a member of. You'll get those circulars come through and they say there's been a new MESA specification, there's been a change to this, etc., etc. There's been an amendment to this Australian standard, which is important. Check it out. And in fact, quite often, a lot of these places have, or these organisations have seminars as well, talking about impending changes. But with your private certifiers, their job is to stay abreast of that all the time. That's what they do. And so they produce their own documents, their own, what is it? No, I can't think of the word for it. But they'll produce their own documents, these summary sheets that help them make their decisions, help them make their assessments of your drawings and specification. And yeah, when things change, they'll let you know. If you send stuff through, they go, oh, you have to do this now. Have a look at it. But also, yeah, councils also very friendly in that way, but they just take longer. So yeah, planning, building features, size, materials, building. Oh, so I should have talked about that with this slide up. Building use, fundamental to our planning decisions. So if you're planning to build what do you call it? Where bikies gather. You want to build a bikie hangout within Kernelight Gardens. Council are going to want to know about it. If you're going to be, do leather tanning or something within, So within the zoning, that's one of the, I guess, the main overriding things with the zoning is what the building use is going to be. And typically you'll have zones which are very prescriptive about what you do. So our zones will be called residential zone. No surprises there as to what we do within that zone. We'll have primary industries zone, so agriculture. We'll have light industrial, which will mean industry which has very few impacts on surrounding uses. We'll have heavy industrial, so plastic recycling and steel works and all these sorts of things. So building use, councils are definitely want to know what that building is used for. So you've got those very prescriptive zones, but you've also got other zones like what you have in Mawson Lakes. If everybody knows Mawson Lakes, they have multiple use zones. So they've gone, okay, well, in this development, we want to see things like retail lower floor, office accommodation on the second floor, residential accommodation on the third floor, the fourth, etc. They want multiple uses within the same site. Typically, that's not the way that development happens or is prescribed through other areas. In other areas, it's far more about segmentation of uses. So shops here, houses here, industrial properties here. And for this property that we're in, so this used to be a heavy industrial site, so it used to be car manufacture. So they used to manufacture cars in this building. To be allowed to use it as a educational facility, the zoning had to be changed. The way in which that happens is, so with this site here, obviously there's state government involvement. State government see, okay, we've got transitioning of industries. We've got, we used to make cars here in South Australia. We no longer make cars in South Australia. That's an industry which has gone away for now. State government realises these changes, and so they'll facilitate that process in a zoning change. But that's not the only way that it happens. you could, as an individual, you could put together a submission to council to say, I want you to change the zoning of my property. Now, typically that's not done because it's not a very simple process, but you do have larger organisations that do that. So a friend of mine used to work for Centro Supermarkets. His job was putting together submissions to councils to say it is in the public's best interest to have a supermarket here. Yes, you might have that as light industrial zoning, residential zoning, etc. Our belief is that a supermarket would be a fantastic thing to have here to serve the community. So it's about creation of these submissions to show that. Now these are not simple documents. But yeah, zoning can be changed. So, but yeah, very important part of that is the building use, and then the relationship to the street community adjoining development. Yeah.
With the change of zoning, if the council makes a decision, then the state can still overrule the decision afterwards?
I don't know. Look, I don't know. Yeah, there'll definitely there are areas in which there's interaction between state concerns and local council concerns, but I don't know what the mechanism is for that interaction or overriding. It would be written in the Development Act and possibly have a mention within the development regulations. But no, I don't know about that. But yeah, there'd be some mechanism for interaction between influence from either way. Yeah, they want to see relationship to street and community and adjoining development. So how does that, how does it sit in the context of that local area? Also, you've got, so when you've got developments, you can have council zoning, and you may not change the zoning, but you might push the envelope a bit. You might change the way, or you may get council to allow things to happen that are not necessarily prescriptive within that zoning. So one instance is, does anybody know the Arts Eco Village at Aldinga? No? I can Google it. It's an interesting thing. Not for everyone, but at Aldinga, does anybody know where Aldinga is? People, yeah. Aldinga is down south. We head out and get on the freeway here, and we drive for 45 minutes. Turn off into Aldinga. It's a coastal. Used to be sort of a township. Now it's kind of merged with the rest of the metropolitan area as the metropolitan area pushes out. But it's on the fringes of that. The Arts Eco Village is, if you turn off the South Road, head towards Port Wollonga, it's there on your right hand side. You probably wouldn't notice it. So you've got Footy Oval on your left, Arts Eco Village on the right, but for all intents and purposes you probably wouldn't notice it. They've bucked that trend very much in terms of having vehicle access to everywhere. So predominantly, a lot of our developments are very car-centric. We design around the car, like how vehicles move around, where they park and things like that. Arts Eco Village has been on, look, we don't really want cars in here. We can allow cars in certain bits, but primarily we've got parking at the front for anybody who wants to be driving to and from. We've got access for emergency services, for ambulances, for fire, etc. But beyond that, we don't want a very car-centric development. Now, that is very much at odds with the development plan for Onkaparinga Council, very much at odds with the surrounding development there. So they've got to have some negotiation to get these things through. Planning approval is not hard and fast. And there are several different ways in which planning approval can be looked at. So we can meet that development plan spot on. We can read it and go, okay, 6.5 metres and this setback, and we do this. tick all the boxes, you can pretty much sure that you put it into council, come back approved. That's great, excellent. Sometimes your client will say, well, look, we really want to do this, and we want to do that, and it doesn't meet the development plan, but it's actually a pretty good idea. You can get that into council as a non-complying development. It doesn't comply with the rules, but council can say, well, that project actually has merit. It doesn't meet everything prescriptively, but it has merit. We can assess that on merit. And then they'll do their assessment. Or you can put it in and they go, well, look, it doesn't really have merit, it doesn't fit within this. And you go, yeah, but we want to apply for that. So you put your application in and they go, well, we can look at this as a non-complying development that will have to have neighbourhood consultation. So you want to do this thing, there's really very little support for you to do that thing, but if the neighbours say, yeah, well, we don't care, that's fine, well then you can do those things. So it's not hard and fast. So you have those three avenues, or those three tiers of your planning approval. But there are also things that you can do, and this is where the consults in this subject come into play, is that you can read through the development plan and see some conflicting things. So it'll say that we want, look, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that will be conflicting, but they'll say, they'll say one thing here, and then later on insinuate another thing, or that they want, they want greenery, but then they also want solar access for the sun, all these sorts of things, and you think, okay, well, in this situation, both of those things are actually conflicting. You can go, right, well, we're going to put our case forward to the council. When we have our discussion with the council, we're going to say, we have considered all of these things. We think this is the most important thing to be abiding by. Yes, we're not abiding by that thing, but we're doing this other thing that you want because we have conflicting things. That gives you a bit of control. Another thing that gives you a bit of control or influence is previous decisions that have been made. So if the council's saying you have to build a house with this sort of setback and this sort of roof pitch, and you go, well, they've only just finished building this lot of places here that don't have that setback, that don't have that roof pitch, or they say you have to have this 8 metre setback, and then you look at Google Earth and you do your measure, or SA Map View, do your measure, and you go, all the other properties are only 4.5 metres off the road. We'd stick out like a sore thumb if we did the 8 metres. You say those things to council, and you say, yeah, it says in your development plan you want a harmonious street frontage, but you also want 8 metres setback. They're two conflicting things. So pick the bit you want to get through. Push that with council and say, look, it says here, we're meeting that, and we're meeting that by ignoring that other thing which we consider to be less important. It is a negotiation. And typically what's going to happen, and I've done it previously, is had a chat with duty planners and say, we're doing this thing for this particular reason. And they'll say, well, that's great, yeah, that's fine. Can you get that to me in writing? So you get that initial feel from them. You go, okay, is that going to happen? Yeah, it's going to happen. Put it in writing and send it to them in an email. Say, this is what we're doing. This is what we discussed. That gets documented. And then when you send your plans through, they've got that there in their file. Go, oh yes, they discussed that. That's good. Okay, cool. So it's not a hard and fast thing. It's a negotiation thing. But the other thing is, and that's something we deal with a lot in this subject, is get it in writing. Keep it stored away. Provide all that communication. Document that stuff. That way, if ever you had that discussion with the duty planner and they said, yeah, we like that, and they say, get that to me in writing, you send them an email that stipulates all of that, and they email you back, say, yeah, thanks a lot, I can't wait to see the plans. If they knock it back for that particular thing, you go, hey, I've got our correspondence here. I've documented our correspondence that spoke about that. So that's about your planning approvals. For your building rules consent, it's starting to look a little bit more about how is the building built. What are the other features of it? So we've got how it complies with NCC, Australian standards, Minister specification, and then engineers details. So as mentioned before, NCC, several different approaches deemed to satisfy, this stuff. Performance solutions, engineers details. Not everything is covered by Australian standards. Sometimes you can be predominantly deemed to satisfy, but then you'll have engineer like a steel portal frame, so you have a larger kitchen Mills family area, or you'll have engineer. You basically, rule of thumb is you'll always have an engineer design your slab for you, your footings for you. There's avenue for doing that through AS 2870. For working your way through that, there are limitations, but really, nobody really wants to have that liability. Nobody really wants to go, I'm going to design my own, or I'm going to design the footings for my client, and then be responsible for that if things start cracking, whatever, because that's incredibly expensive. You're not going to get insurance for that. So your insurer is going to cover you for things, but they're not going to cover you for footings. In fact, a lot of structural engineers won't have insurance for doing footings either. So the company I worked for didn't have insurance for doing footings, because primarily we're repair and reinstatement work. You're not typically repairing and reinstating footings, unless you're just ripping the whole thing up and starting again. So it wasn't in their best interest really to be paying out the exorbitant fees required for having that insurance for footings. So you have engineers that do, they specialise in that. You'll send your stuff to them. So you'll get all of your things, you'll get your plans pretty much done in terms of this is what the building is, these are the point loads, this is the massing of it, this is soil, etc. And you get those footing details. But there are many other engineered solutions. There are all sorts of engineered solutions that if you want to be working outside the box, basically there's, well, okay, yes, we have to abide by the laws of physics. There are some parameters, we can't really extend through. There are limitations about cantilevers and things like that, just because gravity won't allow it. But the main thing, how to say it, the main limitation is how much do you want to spend. So, yes, you can do that big bit of glass. Nobody in Australia manufactures it. You've got to bring it from somewhere else. That's going to be expensive. That sort of thing. But you're going to have a whole heap of information. Firstly, how does it comply with the NCC? So within your drawings, you're going to have a whole heap of notes to say wetty areas as per AS 3740 and blah, 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 blah. You're going to have to say timber trusses as per manufacturer's specifications. You've got to have all these notes. And that's, when I started out drawings didn't have a lot of notes. As the technology has changed, as compliance considerations have grown more and more and more, drawings now contain a lot of notes. So you'll have your drawing set, a dozen pages and 2 pages of notes, or you have, so it's becoming more and more and more like that. Also, I guess when I started out drawing, you still had people doing stuff by hand, not many. Like, professionally you'd be using AutoCAD, but they were still teaching. When I studied, you're learning to do hand drawing. We're not doing that now, as far as I know. So doing all your general notes, if you're doing that by hand drawing, has anybody done hand drawing? Yeah. Doing the text is actually really time consuming. You make a mistake, So predominantly, a lot of drawings were about actually how much information can we convey in a drawn sense. Picture's worth 1,000 words, all that sort of stuff. Whereas now, with putting together all your documentation, computer-aided drawing, you've got all your general notes there. You just grab them, drop them. That's it. The notes are the quick bit now. Drawing anything is the bit that takes time. So things are becoming far more note-centric. So that's a lot of how you're going to say that it complies with the NCC, but not everything you can convey still in notes, or you should convey in notes. You can't note your way out of everything. Is more to the point. Like, for example, if I design a building that only has tiny little windows, there's not enough light and ventilation in that building, I can't just draw it up like that and then have a general note saying all lighting and ventilation as per NCC, blah, 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 blah. You know, it doesn't fit. I've still got to include all that in my drawings. I've got to have my windows the right size. I've got to have fall protection to openable windows in a second story. I've got to have balustrades and balusters to the right dimensions. I can't just draw a line arbitrarily and then say balustrades as per NCC, blah, blah, blah. And then a builder on site scales off the drawings, goes, all right, yeah, that balustrade's at 340, let's build that at 340. There we go. Because if that was ever to go to court, and and somebody says, well, this unfortunate event happened because the balustrade was too low. In court, they're going to go, well, that's where the drafter drew it. That's where they dimensioned it, etc. Look, no. Everything still has to be drawn up in accordance with the NCC. So you can't just go into an office, go, all right, I know how to use Revit, I know how to use AutoCAD, I'll just rely on all of your general notes, and I'll general note my way out of everything. You still have to know all of this stuff. You're also going to have to know all this stuff because at one point in time, you're going to be the person writing those general notes as well. You have to understand all the source documents that go into writing those general notes, whether that's because you're working for yourself, which I think is a fantastic thing if you get to that point. Typically people will want to, and I think it's a very smart thing to work for somebody else first, because you get so much. Like we can teach you a little bit in a short amount of time. You'll keep learning, gleaning off the people you work for. But you're going to have to understand where those general notes come from, the source documents, and when you get a new NCC, like 2019 NCC come out, you've got to make changes. Somebody has to make all those changes to it. So you're going to have to understand those things, and you're going to have to convey all of that within your drawings. And yeah, likewise Australian standards. You're going to have to understand the Australian standards, the relevant Australian standards, and convey all of those things in there. This is actually a huge thing. Now, look, what I'll do is I'll teach you as much as I can through the process. The important thing is, and look, and there's always going to be bits and bobs that people go, hey, do you know this bit? And I'm like, no, because it is huge. It is an ongoing learning process. I know that we can't be, I don't know right word for it. Can't be we can't expect perfection in this, right? But we're going to get to as near perfection as we can, and we're going to understand it as much as we can. But yeah, in practice, you will send off stuff to your private certifier, and private certifier will say, oh no, you can change this. It happens. And it happens for even things that you know very well, but you can't always have insight into everything. One of the big things, and another thing it's not mentioned on here actually, it's for both planning approval and building approval, is the CFS, the Country Fire Service, have some influence on what you do as well. So that's partly governed by Minister's specification. So there's a Minister's specification, SA 78, that says this is how a road must be constructed for CFS trucks, width, slope relationship, surface material, turnaround spaces, all that sort of thing. Also says in there you've got to have this much of dedicated water supply, etc. that bit is fairly clearly explained within the minister's specification. But for any development with, or it says in that minister's specification, for any development within high bushfire risk area, you need to have certification by the CFS. They would do that predominantly in accordance with what's in here, and also another document called AS 3959. They'll be looking at both of those things. But even if you know Minister's Specification SA 78 and 3959 really well, you're not going to be able to always pick what their answer is going to be. That stuff. Sometimes they'll say that is hazardous vegetation. You go, what? That's not hazardous vegetation. That's blackwoods, or that's a deciduous tree, or whatever. These things are not hard and fast. So you'll send stuff to a private certifier, and sometimes, look, and I've done it. I've sent stuff to a private certifier saying, can we, how are we progressing with this? How can we work our way through? And they'll get back and they'll go, yes, we have to have a determination on this thing. This thing has to be assessed. So it's not always that you always got to follow the same path. Sometimes you try. Push stuff through, because if they're going to be happy with it, well then that's on their insurance and that's their decision. But you're going to have some things which you can't always predict. So there will be stuff bouncing back. Definitely, it is in your best interest to have as little stuff bouncing back as possible. It takes time. It takes money. It doesn't look good. If you're working for a client, yes, if you're going to be upfront with your client, say, look, we're pushing the boundaries on this one. Private certifier may be okay with it, may not be okay with it. Let's send it to them, get their opinion on it. Client knows that there's going to be some to and fro. They know that there's going to be time involved. So that helps alleviate that thing. But in the main, it works in your best interest to have stuff really well, all the boxes ticked, everything all tidied up, so it goes through nice and quickly. And you go to your client, yeah, look, we got it through planning consent, got it through building rules consent, ready to go. Thank you. And they'll go, wow, it's so good going with you rather than somebody else. Yeah, so you've got to have all that information on there. Some of it general notes, some of it drawn components, some of it as leaders. So little leaders saying, this is what this thing is. Not everything is always, if we wiped all the leaders off of this, I'd go, okay, well, we've got a strut here, but what is that strut made of? I've got no idea. Is it timber? Is it steel? I look at that and I go, oh, it's probably a 50 by 50 equal angle with some M10s on the end of it. But you don't know. Nobody knows. That's why you need to have these leaders to say, that's what it is. But there are also, some of this, there are drawing conventions as well, which help us interpret some of these things, sometimes without leaders. So does anybody know when you've got a square with an X in it, what that is? Yep. Spot on. Yeah. Piece of timber that's been sliced through. If you've got a square that doesn't have an X, it's a piece of timber in distance. It's not sliced through. All those sorts of things. So we've got drawing conventions. Yeah. And then you have your engineer's details for all your different stuff. Sometimes that will be incorporated into your drawing set. Sometimes it will be supplementary to your drawing set. It all depends. Right. And then we're going through till 1 o'clock today is the thing. Does anybody want to take a break at this point? A bit of a stretch, a bit of a walk. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I'll stop this recording.